If you don't sign the house over, you're not part of this family anymore. Those were the words my daughter-in-law said to me over breakfast, 3 months after I buried my husband. She said them while stirring cream into her coffee as if she were commenting on the weather. My son sat beside her. He looked down at his plate and said nothing. That silence hurt more than the words. I am Margaret Collins. I'm 71 years old, and until that morning, I believed I still had a family. The kitchen felt unusually bright. Sunlight poured through the windows above the sink, reflecting off the white countertops Richard and I had picked out nearly 20 years ago. Every corner of that room carried a memory. The small scratch on the oak table from when Daniel was 10 and tried to carve his initials. The faded curtain my husband insisted was still perfectly fine. The coffee mug with a chipped handle that Richard used every morning for 15 years. I looked around and realized that I was the only person in the room who saw those things. To Emily, my daughter-in-law, this house was square footage, property value, a future investment. To me, it was my life. Emily slid a folder across the table. It stopped inches from my hands. We've talked about this before, she said. This is the logical solution. Logical. That word echoed inside my head. 3 months earlier, I had stood beside my husband's grave holding a folded American flag from his military service. 3 months earlier, people had hugged me and promised they would always be there. 3 months earlier, Daniel had cried on my shoulder and told me we would get through everything together. Yet here we were. A stack of legal papers sat between us like a wall. The house is too much responsibility for one person, Emily continued. You should sign it over now. It makes everything easier. I looked at my son. I waited for him to say something. Anything. I wanted him to remind her that his father and I had spent 36 years paying for this home. That we painted every room ourselves. That we planted every tree in the yard. Instead, he stared at his coffee cup. Daniel? I finally asked. He cleared his throat. Maybe Emily has a point, Mom. The words landed softly, but they carried the weight of a hammer. For a moment, nobody spoke. The refrigerator hummed in the corner. A bird landed outside the window near the feeder Richard used to fill every morning. The ordinary sounds of life continued while something inside me quietly cracked. I expected anger. I expected tears. Instead, I felt strangely calm. Maybe grief changes a person. Maybe after losing the love of your life, there are fewer surprises left in the world. I folded my hands in my lap and looked directly at Emily. And if I don't sign? I asked. She met my eyes without hesitation. Then you're choosing not to be part of this family anymore. The sentence hung in the air. I noticed Daniel shift uncomfortably, but he still said nothing. Not one word. I nodded slowly. Then I stood up from the table. Neither of them tried to stop me. Neither of them apologized. I carried my coffee cup to the sink and rinsed it carefully, the same way I had done thousands of mornings before. Then I walked upstairs without another word. My bedroom still felt like Richard. His favorite sweater remained folded across the chair near the window. His reading glasses sat on the nightstand exactly where he left them. Some mornings I still reached for him before remembering he was gone. I sat on the edge of the bed and stared at the closet door. The house was silent. Downstairs, I could faintly hear Emily and Daniel talking. Their voices blurred together. I didn't want to hear what they were saying. I already knew. For weeks, there had been little signs. Questions about property taxes. Questions about insurance policies. Questions about whether I had updated my will. At the time, I convinced myself they were concerned about my future. Now the pieces fit together differently. I sat there for nearly an hour. The sunlight slowly shifted across the carpet. Finally, I stood and walked toward the hallway closet. Most people would not have noticed anything unusual about it. It looked like an ordinary storage space filled with old blankets and photo albums. But hidden behind a stack of boxes was a small steel lockbox. Richard installed the compartment years ago. Just in case, he always said with a smile. I hadn't opened it since the funeral. My hands trembled slightly as I moved the boxes aside. The lock clicked open. Inside were several documents, old photographs, and one sealed envelope. I froze the moment I saw it. My name was written across the front in Richard's familiar handwriting. Beneath it were 6 words that made my heart stop. Open only if trust is gone. I stared at the envelope for a long time before I opened it. My fingers rested on the seal while memories drifted through my mind like old photographs. Richard had never been a dramatic man. He believed in planning, preparation, and quiet actions instead of big speeches. If he had written those words, there was a reason. Outside the bedroom window, the maple tree in our backyard swayed gently in the afternoon breeze. Richard planted that tree when Daniel graduated from high school. He said he wanted something that would keep growing long after we were gone. Back then, I thought we would spend our later years sitting together on the porch, watching that tree grow older with us. Life had chosen a different path. I finally broke the seal and unfolded the letter. The paper felt fragile in my hands. Richard's handwriting was neat and familiar, each word carefully written. "My dearest Margaret," it began. The moment I saw those words, my vision blurred. For several seconds, I could not continue. I had spent 3 months pretending I was stronger than I felt. 3 months smiling politely at visitors. 3 months thanking people for casseroles and sympathy cards. But seeing his handwriting made the loss feel fresh again. I took a slow breath and kept reading. If you are reading this, something has happened that made you question the people around you. I hope I am wrong. I hope this letter never becomes necessary. But if I know anything about life, it is that grief changes families. Sometimes it brings them closer. Sometimes it reveals things that were hidden all along. My heart began to beat faster. Richard continued by describing small details from our life together. The first apartment we rented. The old station wagon that barely survived our road trips. The summer Daniel broke his arm trying to impress neighborhood kids with a homemade bicycle ramp. Every memory felt like a hand reaching across time. Then the tone of the letter changed. "There are documents in this lockbox that may become important one day," he wrote. "I did not create them because I expected trouble. I created them because protecting you was always my responsibility." I stopped reading and looked toward the bedroom door. Downstairs, I could hear faint footsteps. Emily and Daniel were still in the house. The sound felt strangely distant. For the first time that morning, I no longer felt alone. Richard was gone, but somehow he was still helping me. I returned to the letter. Do not make decisions when people pressure you. Do not sign anything without independent advice. And most importantly, do not confuse guilt with obligation. Those words struck me harder than anything else. For months, I had felt guilty. Guilty that Daniel lost his father. Guilty that I could not somehow make everything normal again. Guilty every time I said no to a request. Richard seemed to understand exactly what I would be feeling. Beneath the letter sat several folders. I carefully removed them from the lockbox. One was labeled property records. Another was labeled estate planning. A third contained financial documents. Everything was organized with the precision Richard brought to every project. I smiled despite myself. He once spent an entire weekend labeling storage bins in the garage. At the time, I teased him for it. Now I was grateful. As I examined the papers, I noticed something unusual. Tucked inside the estate folder was a business card. On the back, Richard had written a name and phone number. Thomas Avery, the attorney who had helped us update our will several years earlier. Underneath the name was a short note. If anything feels wrong, call him first. I looked at the number for several seconds. Then I slipped the card into my pocket. The house suddenly felt different. Earlier that morning, every room seemed filled with uncertainty. Now I felt something else beginning to take shape. Not confidence exactly. More like clarity. The confusion that had clouded my thoughts since Richard's death was slowly lifting. Looking back, the signs had been there. Emily asking about mortgage records even though the house was fully paid off. Emily suggesting that I should simplify my life. Emily repeatedly mentioning retirement communities whenever the subject of the house came up. At the time, I convinced myself she was trying to help. Now I wondered how long those conversations had really been leading here. The afternoon light stretched across the bedroom floor. I carefully returned most of the documents to the lockbox, keeping only the letter and the attorney's card. Then I closed everything and slid the compartment back into place behind the boxes. No one would know I had opened it. No one would know what I had found. For now, that was exactly how I wanted it. I stood and walked to the window. Daniel's car was still parked in the driveway. A few years ago, seeing it there would have filled me with comfort. Today it filled me with questions. I did not know whether my son was being manipulated, whether he was willingly participating, or whether the truth lay somewhere in between. What I did know is this: signing those papers was no longer an option. Not until I understood exactly what was happening. Downstairs, I heard Emily call my name. Her voice sounded cheerful, almost casual. I folded Richard's letter carefully and slipped it into a drawer beside the bed. Then I wiped my eyes, straightened my shoulders, and walked toward the door. If they believed I was a grieving widow too overwhelmed to think clearly, I was not going to correct them. Not yet. Emily was standing in the kitchen when I came downstairs. She smiled the moment she saw me, and the contrast between that smile and the conversation we had shared earlier felt almost surreal. The folder was gone from the table. The coffee cups had been washed. If someone had walked into the room at that moment, they would have thought we were an ordinary family enjoying a quiet afternoon. "There you are," Emily said cheerfully. "I was wondering if you wanted some lunch." I nodded politely. "That sounds nice." The words surprised even me. A few hours earlier, I had felt cornered. Now I felt something entirely different. I felt alert. Richard used to say that when people believe they have already won, they become careless. At the time, I thought he was talking about business. Standing in that kitchen, I began to wonder if he meant life in general. Daniel entered from the backyard carrying a small cardboard box. "Found some old files in the garage," he said. I figured we should start sorting things out. Sorting things out. That phrase had become increasingly common since Richard passed away. Nobody talked about memories anymore. Nobody talked about healing. Everything was about organizing, simplifying, managing, selling, transferring. I watched Daniel place the box on the counter. He avoided looking directly at me. The little boy who once followed me around grocery stores asking endless questions had become a man who could barely hold eye contact with his own mother. "Maybe we can go through some of Dad's paperwork this weekend," he suggested. Emily immediately nodded. "That is a great idea." I kept my expression neutral. "Perhaps." Emily began making sandwiches while Daniel scrolled through his phone. The kitchen filled with ordinary sounds. The hum of the refrigerator. The click of dishes. The distant barking of a neighbor's dog. Yet beneath that normal surface, I felt tension moving through the room like an invisible current. Every sentence seemed carefully chosen. Every glance seemed measured. After lunch, Emily announced she needed to run errands. Daniel offered to drive with her. Within minutes, they were gathering their things. As they prepared to leave, Emily paused beside the doorway. "Think about what we discussed," she said gently. "We only want what is best for everyone." I smiled. "I will." She appeared satisfied with that answer. A few moments later, their car disappeared down the street. The silence that followed felt enormous. For the first time all day, I was completely alone. I walked into the living room and sat in Richard's favorite chair. The fabric still carried faint signs of wear along the armrests where his hands used to rest. A photograph stood on the side table beside me. It showed the three of us at Daniel's college graduation. Richard was smiling proudly. Daniel looked hopeful. Looking at that picture now felt like looking through a window into another lifetime. I reached into my pocket and removed Thomas Avery's business card. The phone number stared back at me. Richard had specifically told me to call if something felt wrong. Well, something definitely felt wrong. I picked up the phone and dialed. The call connected after 3 rings. Avery and Associates, a receptionist answered. "How may I help you?" My voice felt strangely steady. "My name is Margaret Collins. I believe Thomas Avery worked with my husband and me several years ago." There was a brief pause. Then the receptionist's tone softened. "Mrs. Collins, please hold for a moment." Less than a minute later, a familiar voice came on the line. "Margaret." Thomas sounded genuinely surprised. "I am glad to hear from you, although I wish it were under better circumstances." We exchanged a few polite words. Then he asked a simple question. What happened? I stared out the window at the empty driveway. For a moment, I considered minimizing everything. Pretending I was overreacting. Pretending I was imagining things. Then I remembered Richard's letter. Do not confuse guilt with obligation. Slowly, I told Thomas about the breakfast conversation. I told him about the pressure to transfer the house. I told him about the documents. When I finished, the line remained silent for several seconds. Finally, Thomas spoke. Margaret, I think you should come see me as soon as possible. My stomach tightened. Why? Another pause followed. Because about 2 months before Richard passed away, he asked me to prepare something very unusual. I gripped the phone more tightly. What do you mean? I would rather explain in person, Thomas replied carefully. But I can tell you this. Your husband was concerned about protecting you. More concerned than most people realized. I felt a chill run through me despite the warm afternoon sunlight pouring through the windows. Did he tell you why? I asked. Thomas hesitated. Not directly. But he did mention that he had started noticing things that troubled him. The room seemed to grow quieter. Outside, a breeze moved through the maple tree Richard had planted years ago. The leaves shimmered in the sunlight. Can you come tomorrow morning? Thomas asked. Yes, I answered immediately. Good. Bring the documents from the lockbox. And Margaret. Yes. Until we meet, do not sign anything. No matter how much pressure anyone puts on you. After the call ended, I sat motionless for a long time. Richard had seen something before he died. Something serious enough to make preparations. Something serious enough to leave warnings behind. For the first time since opening that envelope, I realized the letter was not simply a husband trying to comfort his wife. It was a husband trying to protect her from a danger he believed might one day arrive. And judging by the conversation at breakfast, that day had finally come. That night, I barely slept. The house settled around me with its familiar creaks and quiet sounds, but my thoughts refused to settle. Every time I closed my eyes, I heard Thomas Avery's voice telling me that Richard had prepared something unusual. I kept returning to the same question. What had Richard seen? What had worried him enough to leave warnings behind? Around 3 in the morning, I got out of bed and walked downstairs. The kitchen was dark except for the faint glow of the clock above the stove. I made myself a cup of tea and sat alone at the table. The same table where Daniel used to do homework. The same table where Richard and I spent countless evenings talking about retirement, travel plans, and grandchildren we hoped would someday arrive. Back then, the future felt simple. Looking back, I realized the changes had started long before Richard became ill. Emily had always been polite. In fact, that was part of what made everything so difficult to understand. She never raised her voice. She never openly argued. Instead, she worked quietly, gradually, almost invisibly. I remembered a family barbecue 4 years earlier. Richard had suggested inviting some of our old friends. Emily smiled and said it might be better to keep things smaller. Somehow the guest list changed. Then another holiday arrived and another tradition disappeared. One by one, small things vanished. Sunday dinners became less frequent. Family gatherings moved to locations Emily preferred. Decisions that once involved everyone became decisions made by only a few people. At the time, none of it seemed important. Looking back, it felt like watching puzzle pieces slowly click together. By morning, I was exhausted but determined. I gathered the documents from the lockbox and placed them carefully inside a leather tote bag. At 9 o'clock sharp, I drove across town to Thomas Avery's office. The building was located near the courthouse in a part of town Richard always liked because the old brick architecture reminded him of the city where he grew up. The receptionist greeted me warmly and led me into a conference room. A few minutes later, Thomas entered carrying a thick folder. His expression was kind but serious. After we exchanged greetings, he sat across from me and folded his hands on the table. Margaret, he began, before we discuss the documents, there is something you should know. My stomach tightened. Thomas opened the folder and removed several pages. About 8 weeks before Richard passed away, he requested a private meeting. During that meeting, he asked a number of questions about asset protection, property transfers, and elder financial pressure. I frowned. Why? Thomas sighed softly. Because he was concerned. The room felt very quiet. Concerned about what? I asked. Thomas studied me for a moment before answering. He told me he had noticed unusual conversations taking place whenever the subject of the house came up. He said certain questions were being repeated. Questions about ownership, transfer procedures, and future inheritance. My heart sank. Emily. Thomas did not answer directly, but his silence said enough. I stared at the documents spread across the table. Suddenly, memories surfaced with startling clarity. Emily asking whether the deed was stored in a safe place. Emily mentioning how large the property taxes must be. Emily suggesting that maintaining a house at my age could become difficult. Richard had noticed it too. Unlike me, he had not dismissed those moments. There is more, Thomas said gently. He slid a document toward me. Richard established additional legal protections. He wanted to ensure that no major property transfer could occur without independent legal review. I looked down at the page. The language was formal, but the meaning was clear. Richard had anticipated the possibility that someone might try to pressure me after he was gone. A lump formed in my throat. Even in his final months, he had been trying to protect me. Thomas leaned back in his chair. Richard loved you very much, Margaret. I nodded quietly. For several seconds, neither of us spoke. Finally, I asked the question that had been haunting me all night. Do you think he knew exactly what was going to happen? Thomas considered his answer carefully. I think he hoped he was wrong. But I also think he wanted you prepared if he was right. When our meeting ended, I stepped outside into the bright morning sunshine. People moved along the sidewalks carrying coffee cups and briefcases. Cars rolled through intersections. Life continued exactly as it always had. Yet everything felt different. For months I had viewed myself as a grieving widow trying to keep her family together. Now I understood something important. This was no longer about grief. This was no longer about misunderstandings. Richard had seen warning signs before he died. He had left protections behind. And somewhere between the breakfast ultimatum and the documents sitting in my bag, I realized I was no longer searching for answers. I was beginning to uncover a plan that had been unfolding for much longer than I ever imagined. The drive home felt longer than usual. Every traffic light seemed to hold me in place just long enough for another memory to surface. By the time I pulled into my driveway, I no longer saw the house the same way. For decades, it had been the center of family birthdays, holiday dinners, and quiet Sunday afternoons. Now it felt like the center of a struggle I never asked for. Daniel's car was already parked outside. So was Emily's. Through the front window, I could see movement in the kitchen. They were waiting for me. I sat in the car for a moment and watched the house. Richard used to tell me that people reveal themselves when they think nobody is paying attention. I had spent years paying attention to everyone except myself. That was about to change. When I stepped inside, Emily greeted me immediately. "There you are," she said with a bright smile. "We were wondering how your appointment went." I set my purse on the entry table. It was fine. Her eyes lingered on my bag for half a second. A small detail. Easy to miss. But I noticed it. Daniel emerged from the kitchen carrying a glass of iced tea. "Everything okay, Mom?" he asked. I studied his face. He looked nervous. Not guilty. Not angry. Nervous. There was a difference. "Everything is fine," I replied. We sat together in the living room. Emily quickly shifted the conversation toward practical matters. Property maintenance. Insurance costs. Yard work. Every topic somehow circled back to the house. It was almost impressive how naturally she did it. Eventually, she leaned forward. "Have you thought any more about simplifying things?" she asked. I smiled politely. "Actually, I have." Both of them straightened slightly. Emily's expression brightened. "And?" she asked. I folded my hands calmly. "I think I need more time." The disappointment was immediate, although Emily tried to hide it. "More time," she repeated. "For what exactly?" I glanced toward the family photographs displayed along the bookshelf. "For thinking. For grieving. For making sure I understand everything." The room grew quiet. Daniel looked relieved. Emily did not. "We are only trying to help," she said. "I know," I answered gently. The conversation ended there, but the atmosphere changed. For the rest of the afternoon, I noticed small things. Emily checking her phone repeatedly. Daniel avoiding certain topics. A tension neither of them could completely disguise. That evening, after they left, I walked through the house room by room. The living room. The dining room. Richard's workshop in the garage. Every space held traces of a life we built together. In the workshop, his old workbench remained exactly as he left it. Tools hung neatly on the wall. A half-finished birdhouse sat in the corner. Richard had started building it for a neighbor's grandson. He never got the chance to finish. I ran my fingers across the smooth wood and smiled sadly. Then something caught my attention. A small notebook sat near the back of the workbench. I recognized it immediately. Richard used notebooks for everything. Home projects, financial planning, grocery lists. Curious, I opened it. Most pages contained ordinary notes, measurements, supply lists, maintenance reminders. Then I reached a section near the back. Several names had been written there. Mine, Daniel's, Emily's. Next to each name were brief observations. My heart began to pound. Richard had been documenting things. Nothing dramatic. Just details. Dates. Conversations. Comments that apparently bothered him enough to record. One entry stopped me cold. 6 months before his death, Richard had written, "Emily asked again whether the deed could be transferred before probate." Strange amount of interest. Another entry from 3 months later read, "Daniel seems uncomfortable whenever property comes up. Need to speak with him privately." I lowered myself onto a stool and kept reading. Page after page revealed the same pattern. Questions. Concerns. Small incidents that meant little on their own but looked very different together. Richard had been watching. Quietly. Carefully. The final entry was dated less than 3 weeks before he passed away. I stared at the words for a long time. "If anything happens to me, Margaret must not be pressured into making quick decisions." That was all he wrote. 1 sentence. 12 words. Yet it felt heavier than everything else combined. I closed the notebook and sat in silence. Outside, the sun was beginning to set. Long shadows stretched across the driveway. For months I had believed grief was the reason everything felt uncertain. Now I understood that uncertainty had another source. Richard had seen warning signs long before I did. He left clues in letters, legal documents, and even in the notes he kept for himself. The question was no longer whether something was wrong. The question was how far it went. As I carried the notebook back inside, my phone rang. The caller identification displayed a number I did not recognize. Normally, I would have ignored it. This time I answered. A woman's voice came through the line. "Mrs. Collins," she asked. "My name is Karen Whitmore. I used to work at First Community Bank. I know this may sound strange, but there is something about your late husband that I think you need to hear." For a moment, I did not answer. I stood in the middle of my kitchen holding the phone while the evening sunlight stretched across the floor. Karen Whitmore waited patiently on the other end of the line. "How did you know my husband?" I finally asked. "I knew him through the bank," she replied. "Richard was a longtime customer. We spoke several times during the last year of his life." Something in her voice immediately caught my attention. She sounded cautious. Not dramatic. Not eager to gossip. Just careful. "What is this about?" I asked. There was a brief pause. "I recently retired," Karen said. "While cleaning out old files at home, I came across some notes from a meeting with your husband. I debated whether I should contact you. After hearing about his passing, I assumed everything had already been handled. Then I heard something that changed my mind." My grip tightened around the phone. "What did you hear?" "I heard that there may be plans to sell your house." The room seemed to grow very still. "Who told you that?" I asked quietly. A former colleague mentioned that a local real estate agent had been discussing a property that sounded very familiar. When I heard the address, I remembered the conversation I had with Richard. I sat down slowly at the kitchen table. The same table where Emily had placed those documents in front of me. "What conversation?" Karen took a breath. About 9 months ago, your husband requested a private appointment. He wanted information about protecting assets from unwanted pressure. At the time, I thought he was simply being cautious. But during the meeting, he made several comments that stayed with me. My heart began to race. Another person. Another warning. Another piece of the puzzle. What kind of comments? I asked. He told me he was worried someone might try to convince you to make major financial decisions after he was gone. He specifically mentioned the house. I closed my eyes. The pattern was becoming impossible to ignore. Richard had spoken to Thomas. He had documented concerns in his notebook. Now I was learning he had consulted the bank as well. Did he mention names? I asked. Karen hesitated. No. He never accused anyone directly. But he did say something I wrote down because it seemed important. Papers rustled on the other end of the line. Then Karen read from her notes. Margaret trusts people because she loves them. If I am not here, she may need protection from those who see assets before they see family. I felt a lump rise in my throat. That sounded exactly like Richard. Calm. Thoughtful. Protective. Even in a conversation with a banker, he was thinking about me. There is something else, Karen continued. A few months later, someone contacted the bank asking general questions about property transfer procedures. My pulse quickened. Who? I cannot discuss private client information in detail, she said carefully. But I can tell you that Richard became aware of those inquiries. He was not happy. I stared across the room toward the window above the sink. The sun was lower now. Long shadows stretched across the backyard. For years I believed our family problems began after Richard died. Now I was beginning to understand they may have started while he was still alive. He simply protected me from seeing them. After I thanked Karen, we ended the call. I remained seated for a long time. My mind replayed every conversation from the past year. Every strange question. Every awkward moment. Every time Emily steered discussions toward money, property, or inheritance. The evidence was no longer scattered. It was beginning to form a picture. Then my phone buzzed again. This time it was a text message from Emily. Daniel and I would love to take you to dinner tomorrow night. Family only. I stared at the screen. A week earlier, I would have interpreted that invitation as kindness. Now I saw something different. Timing. Pressure. Strategy. They wanted an answer. They expected progress. They believed I was still confused and vulnerable. Slowly, I typed a response. That sounds wonderful. I would love to join you. A few seconds later, 3 cheerful heart emojis appeared on my screen. I almost laughed. Emily thought the conversation was moving in her favor. She thought I was finally coming around. For the first time since this began, I understood something important. I did not need to confront anyone yet. I did not need to argue. I did not need to reveal what I knew. In fact, the less they knew, the better. Richard had spent months quietly gathering information. Thomas had advised patience. Karen had confirmed the pattern. The smartest move was the simplest one. Let them believe their plan was working. Let them think I was alone. Let them think I was overwhelmed. Because while they were preparing for me to surrender the house, I was quietly preparing to discover exactly how far this plan really went. The next evening I arrived at the restaurant 10 minutes early. It was a quiet place near the edge of town, one of those family-owned establishments with warm lighting, framed photographs on the walls, and the smell of fresh bread drifting from the kitchen. Richard and I used to come here on anniversaries. Choosing this location had not been an accident. Emily knew the memories attached to it. When Daniel and Emily arrived, both seemed unusually cheerful. Daniel hugged me and asked how I had been feeling. Emily complimented my sweater and immediately ordered my favorite soup before I even looked at the menu. If someone had watched us from another table, they would have seen a happy family enjoying dinner together. I almost admired how carefully the performance had been arranged. The conversation stayed light through appetizers and the main course. We talked about the weather, local construction projects, and a neighbor who recently moved to Florida. Several times I noticed Emily glance at Daniel, as though silently reminding him of something. Finally, after dessert arrived, she leaned forward slightly. "Margaret," she said softly, There is something Daniel and I have been discussing. I lowered my spoon and looked at her. What is that? She smiled. We have been thinking about your future. There it was again. That phrase. Your future. Not your happiness. Not your wishes. Your future. Daniel nodded. We just want to make sure everything is secure. I kept my expression calm. That is very thoughtful. Encouraged, Emily continued. The truth is, houses like yours are becoming harder to maintain. Property taxes keep rising. Repairs are expensive. You deserve less stress. I listened carefully. The words sounded almost identical to previous conversations. The same themes. The same concerns. The same destination. What would you suggest? I asked. Emily exchanged a quick glance with Daniel. Then she reached into her purse and removed a folder. For a split second, satisfaction flashed across her face. She thought this was the moment everything would finally move forward. Nothing urgent, she said. Just information. We met with a financial consultant who outlined some options. I accepted the folder and opened it slowly. Inside were brochures for retirement communities, housing developments, and financial planning services. One brochure had several sections highlighted with yellow marker. Another contained handwritten notes. I flipped through the pages carefully. Then I noticed something that made my pulse quicken. Tucked near the back was a business card from a real estate agency. Written across the corner was a figure. The estimated value of my house. My eyes remained fixed on the number for several seconds. It was not a casual estimate. It was detailed, recent, specific. Someone had already done substantial research. I looked up and smiled politely. You have certainly been busy. Emily laughed lightly. We only wanted to be prepared. Prepared. Another interesting word. I closed the folder and thanked them for gathering the information. The surprise on Emily's face was almost invisible. She expected resistance. Instead, I appeared cooperative. For the rest of dinner, she seemed increasingly relaxed. By the time the check arrived, she looked almost relieved. As we stood to leave, Daniel placed a hand on my shoulder. I am glad you are thinking about this, Mom. I looked at him carefully. There was genuine hope in his eyes. Not greed. Not excitement. Hope. And suddenly I realized something that had been bothering me for days. Daniel might not know the entire picture. He clearly believed he was helping. Whether that belief came from trust, manipulation, or simple avoidance remained unclear, but the distinction mattered. On the drive home, I replayed every moment of the evening. Emily had revealed more than she intended. The real estate valuation confirmed active planning. The consultant materials suggested preparation. The folder itself proved that conversations had been happening long before they approached me. When I pulled into my driveway, another vehicle was parked across the street. At first, I paid little attention. Then I noticed a familiar face behind the wheel. Thomas Avery. I parked and walked over. He stepped out holding a large envelope. I was hoping to catch you, he said. I received something this afternoon. My stomach tightened immediately. What is it? Thomas handed me the envelope. Across the front, written in Richard's unmistakable handwriting, were the words, "Deliver only if pressure begins." I stared at the envelope. Another safeguard. Another layer of preparation. Another sign that Richard had anticipated far more than I ever imagined. And judging by the serious expression on Thomas's face, whatever was inside might finally explain why my husband spent his final months quietly preparing for a battle he knew he would not be there to fight. I did not open the envelope immediately. Instead, I carried it inside and placed it on the dining room table. For several minutes, I simply stared at it. The house was quiet. The clock on the wall ticked steadily. Outside, a light rain had begun to fall, tapping softly against the windows. Richard had left behind letters, documents, notes, and warnings. Each one revealed another layer of a story I never knew existed. Somehow, I knew this envelope would be no different. I carefully broke the seal and removed the contents. Inside was a handwritten letter and a packet of legal documents. The first line stopped me cold. If you are reading this, then the pressure has already started. I sat down slowly and continued reading. Richard explained that during the final year of his life, he became increasingly concerned about conversations surrounding the house. He emphasized that he never wanted me to feel frightened or suspicious, which was why he chose not to burden me with every concern while he was alive. But he had quietly investigated. He had spoken with attorneys, financial advisors, and trusted professionals. Most importantly, he had established safeguards that would activate if certain events occurred. I turned the page. Margaret, if someone attempts to convince you to transfer ownership of the house, there is something you need to know. My hands trembled slightly. Attached behind the letter was a legal document bearing official signatures and notarized seals. I read every line twice, then a third time. The meaning was astonishing. Several years earlier, Richard had created a special property trust. The structure was designed specifically to prevent any forced transfer or sale without multiple layers of independent review. Even if I voluntarily agreed, the process would trigger mandatory evaluations and legal protections. In simple terms, nobody could quietly take control of the property. Richard had built a wall around the house long before anyone realized one might be needed. I leaned back in my chair and closed my eyes. Relief washed over me, followed by sadness. Even while facing his own mortality, Richard had spent precious time protecting me. The next morning, I called Thomas Avery. After reviewing the documents, he confirmed everything. "Your husband was extraordinarily thorough," he said. "These protections are stronger than I expected." Then his tone shifted slightly. "There is another reason I wanted you to see this package." My stomach tightened. "What is it?" Richard instructed me to schedule a family meeting if pressure continued. He wanted certain information disclosed in a formal setting. I looked out the window toward the backyard. The maple tree swayed gently in the breeze. "A family meeting?" "Yes," Thomas replied. He believed the truth would eventually need to come into the open. 2 days later, Emily called. Her voice sounded unusually upbeat. "We were wondering if you had time this weekend," she said. "There are a few papers we would like to review together." I almost smiled. The timing was remarkable. "Actually," I replied, "I was hoping we could all meet somewhere. There are some things I would like to discuss too." A brief silence followed. "Of course," Emily said. "Whatever you prefer." We agreed to meet the following Saturday at Thomas Avery's office. After the call ended, I noticed something unexpected. I was no longer anxious. For weeks I had felt as though events were happening to me. Now the feeling had changed. I was finally seeing the larger picture. Every warning Richard left behind had pointed toward this moment. Every note, every document, every conversation had led here. Saturday arrived with clear skies and bright sunshine. I reached Thomas's office 15 minutes early. The conference room was quiet and neatly arranged. Several folders rested on the polished table. Thomas greeted me warmly and asked whether I felt prepared. "I think so," I answered honestly. A few minutes later, Daniel and Emily arrived. Emily entered first, carrying a leather portfolio. Daniel followed behind her. Both appeared confident. In fact, Emily looked almost relieved. She seemed convinced that today would finally resolve everything. As everyone settled into their seats, Thomas closed the conference room door and took his place at the head of the table. The atmosphere immediately changed. The casual friendliness disappeared. This was no longer a family conversation over coffee. This was something far more serious. Thomas opened a folder and adjusted his glasses. Then he looked directly at all three of us. "Before we discuss any property matters," he said calmly, "there are several instructions left by Richard Collins that must be addressed." For the first time since entering the room, Emily's confident smile faltered. The room remained silent for several seconds after Thomas spoke. Emily shifted slightly in her chair. Daniel looked confused. I sat quietly and watched. For weeks I had listened while other people explained what was best for me. Now it was time to hear what Richard wanted said. Thomas opened the first folder and removed a document. Several years ago, he began, Richard Collins established legal protections regarding the family home and associated assets. Emily's expression tightened. Daniel frowned. "What kind of protections?" he asked. Thomas looked at him calmly. The kind designed to prevent pressure, manipulation, or rushed transfers. No one spoke. Thomas continued. He explained the trust structure. He explained the review requirements. He explained that the property could not simply be signed away because someone wanted it transferred. Every sentence seemed to drain a little more confidence from Emily's face. Then Thomas reached for another document. There is also a personal statement Richard instructed me to read if these protections ever became relevant. My heart skipped. I had not seen this document before. Thomas unfolded several pages. The room grew even quieter. To my family, he read. If these words are being read, then circumstances have unfolded exactly as I feared they might. I hope that is not the case. But hope is not a plan, and I have always believed in planning. I could almost hear Richard's voice. Daniel lowered his eyes. Thomas continued reading. Richard wrote about our marriage. About the sacrifices we made together. About the years spent building a life from almost nothing. Then the tone changed. Margaret is not merely living in this house. She helped create it. She sacrificed for it. She protected it. Anyone who treats her as an obstacle rather than a family member has fundamentally misunderstood what this home represents. Emily stared at the table. Daniel looked visibly uncomfortable. Thomas turned another page. If anyone attempts to pressure Margaret into surrendering her rights, they should understand something clearly. My wife owes no one her home. She owes no one her independence. And she owes no one ownership of the life we built together. A lump formed in my throat. Even after his death, Richard was standing beside me. Thomas paused briefly before reading the final section. Family is not proven by inheritance. Family is proven by respect. The moment someone tries to earn property by diminishing another person's dignity, they stop acting like family. The words settled heavily across the room. No one moved. No one interrupted. When Thomas finally placed the papers down, the silence felt enormous. Daniel spoke first. Dad wrote all that? His voice sounded smaller than usual. Yes, Thomas replied. Daniel leaned back slowly. For the first time, he looked genuinely shaken. Then he turned toward me. Mom, why did you not tell me any of this? I studied my son carefully. The question sounded sincere. Because I only learned it myself, I answered. Emily finally spoke. This is being blown out of proportion. Thomas immediately looked at her. Is it? He asked. The question hung in the air. Emily opened her mouth, then closed it again. There was no easy argument against documents, notes, letters, financial consultations, legal protections, and months of preparation. Richard had left too much evidence behind. The story could no longer be explained away as misunderstanding. Eventually, Daniel turned toward Emily. Did you already contact a real estate agent? He asked quietly. Emily hesitated. That hesitation answered the question before she spoke. Daniel's face changed. Not dramatically. Just enough for me to recognize disappointment. He looked back at the folders on the table. Then at me. Mom, he said softly, I am sorry. I believed him. Not because the words were perfect. Not because they erased what happened. I believed him because it was the first honest thing I had heard from him in weeks. The meeting ended shortly afterward. No documents were signed. No transfers were discussed. No pressure remained. As I stepped outside the office building, sunlight warmed my face. The air felt lighter somehow. Thomas walked beside me toward the parking lot. Richard would be proud of you, he said quietly. I smiled. No, I replied. He would probably remind me that he planned most of this. Thomas laughed. That sounds like Richard. Later that afternoon, I returned home alone. I unlocked the front door and stepped inside. The house felt peaceful again. Not because everything was fixed. Not because every relationship had healed. But because the truth was finally out in the open. I walked to the kitchen window and looked toward the maple tree Richard planted years ago. Its branches moved gently in the breeze. For a long time, I stood there thinking about everything that had happened. Emily thought the house was the prize. She never understood that the house was never the point. The point was respect. The point was dignity. The point was remembering who helped build the family in the first place. They saw a 71-year-old widow. Richard saw the woman who stood beside him for decades. And in the end, that made all the difference.